Hi, I'm Hal Roberts. This is Bridge City News. Here's some of the top stories we've been following. A request by the truck driver responsible for the Humboldt Broncos bus crash to stay in Canada was denied by a judge. Lethbridge police are warning about a rental scam which is making the rounds in our city. And we hear from an Ontario Conservative MP who explains why she says Federal Environment Minister Stephen Guilbeault is a hypocrite.
Your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News with Hal Roberts.
Thanks so much for joining us. A judge shot down applications from the truck driver who caused the deadly Humboldt Broncos bus crash to stay in Canada. Jaskrit Singh Sidhu has been fighting being deported back to India. He was given 8 years in prison for causing the 2018 crash, which killed 16 people and injured 13 others. He had pleaded guilty to dangerous driving charges. He was granted parole earlier this year. Now, the Canada Border Services Agency had recommended that Sidhu be deported. Sidhu's lawyer, however, says he plans to apply to have his client's permanent resident status reinstated on humanitarian grounds. It appears as though there's another rental scam which is making the rounds here in southwestern Alberta. Lethbridge Police Sergeant Kevin Talbot is with the Economic Crimes Unit, and he joins us now from here in Lethbridge to talk more about it. So, Sergeant Talbot, how does this rental scam actually work?
A scammer will put up a fictitious ad on a variety of different web platforms and advertising that they're renting a home or a condo or something like that. They start off, they change their communication to something a little more private, and then they began that process of telling the individuals about what the property's like and all that kind of stuff. They'll share some pictures. The pictures will be quite vague. It'll usually just be pictures of the outside because they actually don't own the property and can't access the inside. And then what they will do is they'll come up with a variety of excuses of why they can't meet the individual in person, which is your first red flag. From there, some victims are convinced to go ahead and sign a lease agreement, share personal information about themselves in order to facilitate that agreement. And then ultimately, they'll transfer funds electronically without ever meeting the individual that's renting the property or going to the property to view it.
So how can those who are looking for rental property actually protect themselves?
You should absolutely see the place that you're attempting to rent for in person, or have someone represent you to go and see the property if you're not living in the city. Quite often, these individuals, the victims, are from out of town, so it's just very convenient to do this all online. And if you can't, then don't rent it without seeing it in person or having somebody take a look at it for yourself. The second thing is don't ever send money to anyone you've never met. You have no way of verifying that this person is actually who they say they are, and that they're not trying to defraud you of your money.
Thanks so much, Sergeant. That was Sergeant Kevin Talbot with Economic Crimes Unit of the Lethbridge Police Service. The LPS recently made a series of posts on social media on what your rights are when interacting with police officers. Inspector Jason Walper says the least known right for people is how they're allowed to simply walk away from a police officer.
I think probably the least known thing is that without a lawful reason for approaching and stopping and talking to a member of the public, that the public can leave. Certainly they are free to go. They're free to not answer questions if they don't wish to do so, unless, of course, those parameters of the lawful detainment are in place. But certainly, I think that's one thing that maybe members of our public don't know, is that if you are being stopped and stopped and spoken to by the officer, if there's no reason for the officer legally to obtain information from you or to detain you or arrest you, you are free to go.
Walper adds that there are times when police will approach you, but not because you've allegedly broken the law. He says sometimes they're just collecting information regarding a complaint that was made in the vicinity. Well, we experienced a little bit of fog earlier today in Lethbridge, but fortunately it all lifted. Weather analyst Jeanette Rocher is now looking a little bit like a Christmas elf, and she's got an early peek at the forecast. Jeanette, it appears as though we should have a mainly sunny weekend with temperatures at or above the freezing mark.
Yeah, well, since this is my last weather report of 2023, I figured I'd get right into the Christmas spirit, Hal. But yes, let's keep it above that freezing mark, shall we? And over the past several days, we have actually been exceeding our daily high. Today's high was only expected to be -1. Well, we were already up to 6 degrees by the noon hour. So into tomorrow, Saturday, we're looking for a daily high of 4 degrees. So let's see if we maybe exceed that as well. Past that, we're going to get even warmer, and I'll be back later in the show to tell you just how warm those last few days before Christmas will be.
Nice Christmas outfit. Thanks so much, Jeanette. U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan says there is no contradiction between Israel saying its war against Hamas is going to take months, while also saying that different phases will take place at different times during that time frame.
When Israel launched this campaign to root out the terrorist threat that Hamas poses to the state of Israel, it made clear from the beginning that this war would proceed in phases. We are now in the middle of a high-intensity phase with ongoing ground operations, military operations, in both the northern half and the southern half of Gaza. But there will be a transition to another phase of this war, one that is focused in more precise ways on targeting the leadership and on intelligence-driven operations that continues to deal with the ongoing threat that Hamas poses.
Following meetings in Tel Aviv, Sullivan traveled to the West Bank to meet with Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas. Abbas is calling for an immediate ceasefire and more aid for Gaza. Sullivan says when he met with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, they discussed the dire hostage situation.
Yesterday and today, I've met with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his war cabinet, President Herzog, and a range of senior officials. We discussed the ongoing war and military operations. We discussed our shared objective of ensuring that Hamas will never again pose a threat to the state of Israel, while minimizing harm to civilians, while ensuring the increased and sustained flow of humanitarian assistance into Gaza, and while working day in and day out, hour by hour, to secure the release of all of the remaining hostages so that they can return home to their loved ones.
U.S. President Joe Biden urged Israel to think about the civilians when going after Hamas in Gaza. He says there really needs to be more of a focus on saving lives.
I want them to be focused on how to save civilian lives, not stop going after Hamas, but be more careful.
Meanwhile, a group of Israeli women gathered calling for a ceasefire in the war between Israel and Hamas. They say too many innocent lives have been lost and the war needs to end now.
We want to save the lives that remain, because every minute that passes by just causes more misery and more pain that will be very, very hard to reverse.
We will only see peace when everybody has equal rights and freedom, and we can't have peace unless this happens. If one people have rights and other people are oppressed, there won't be justice and there won't be peace.
A former commander of a destroyer in the U.S. Navy, Kirk Lippold, says the United States must hold Iran accountable for funding many of the proxy wars we are seeing today and supplying terrorist groups such as Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthi rebels with weapons. Lippold says the Biden administration must take drastic action right now. He made the comment on TBN's Centerpoint program.
We need to stop Iran doing what they're doing. We are not going to get a nuclear agreement that is going to keep the region or us or the world safe. That is gone. They've already enriched. And the bottom line is Iran and the Ayatollahs need to be confronted as the #1 state sponsor of terrorism and stopped in their tracks.
Canada's Emergency Preparedness Minister Harjit Sajjan says our country is developing a national disaster response agency. He says he's looking at models in other countries that builds out of local level agencies and reserve type forces.
So we have to look at is what we need immediately and what capabilities are needed at the provincial level and at the federal level so that there's no gap in response. And we're looking at potentially enhancing a program where we could use a civilian response for, where we have at the federal level, control at the federal level, but held at the provincial level, a response force that can do type 2 wildfires, respond to floods or other emergencies. And then at the end of the day, yes, I believe that we will have something that's going to be at the federal level of a response force. I can't give you the answer just yet because it's important for us to really work at the ground level to get a better understanding what those needs are, because ultimately, whatever we had at the provincial or the federal level has to respond to the emergency. We need to get that right.
Ontario Conservative MP Melissa Lantsman says the Trudeau Liberals are a bunch of hypocrites. She says it's interesting that Santa isn't the only one who flies around the world, but so does our federal Environment Minister, Stephen Guilbeault. Except Santa, she says, flies in a sleigh while Guilbeault is in a carbon-emitting private jet.
He flies on a private jet from Beijing to Dubai. He burns fuel and taxpayer dollars just to rub elbows with dictators and pop stars. He emits more carbon in one flight than most Canadians do in a whole year, while telling Canadians to pay more carbon taxes. The more he flies around, the higher the tax goes. So will he park the hypocrisy and finally axe the tax?
Speaking of hypocrisy, Madam Speaker, we know what the Conservatives wanted to give Canadians for Christmas, and that's cuts to the vital programs and services that they care for. In fact, just last week, they voted against $10 a day childcare. They voted against dental care for seniors and for children. They voted against Operation Unifier, which is an important NATO mission to Ukraine. And in fact, when they refer to Ukraine as a far foreign land, they forget that the country that is invading them is Russia, which is a border of Canada as well, and we want to protect our sovereignty here at home. That's what they would give to Canadians.
The final regulations for the Online News Act shows the amount of funding both private broadcasters and the CBC will get through Ottawa's $100 million deal with Google will be limited. The regulation shows private broadcasters will receive at most $30 million from the fund. Canada's public broadcaster, meanwhile, will see no more than $7 million. The rest of the funds are earmarked for other qualifying news outlets like newspapers and digital platforms.
Having more equitable relationships and commercial relationships between tech giants and our newsroom is an essential part of ensuring the sustainability of our news sector and ensuring that journalism continues to play its role in democracy. It's also a first of its kind in the world, where we have a transparent and viable legislation where smaller news outlets also have a seat at the negotiating table with the tech giants. So this is extremely good for Canadians. It's good for democracy, and I think it's a good step for the rest of the world as well.
Well, let's see if Bridge City News gets any of that. Last month, Google agreed to contribute $100 million a year to Canadian news publishers indexed to inflation, leaving it exempt from having to enter into compensation agreements with news publishers for linking to their content. The legislation will begin on December the 19th. Officials at McGill University say new requirements that 80% of out-of-province students learn conversational French will be impossible to meet. Fabrice Lebeau, McGill University's deputy provost, also discussed a planned tuition increase.
You put a full semester of French courses in engineering program, you lose your accreditation. We have no longer engineering programs. Same applies to all our other accredited programs. So you don't want to lose your academic integrity to achieve another objective that you want to achieve, but that becomes impossible to achieve because of the conditions that are being imposed.
We've seen an initial proposal from the government. The initial measures were saying $17,000 is the price we want to put on CNRQ students, the Canadian non-residents of Quebec students. Then they came back with $12,000, and I've heard the minister say today that at $12,000, on fait le pari que les étudiants vont venir. So we're betting that they will come. Doesn't sound like based on a lot of data to me.
You don't bet on the future of a province.
Representatives from the automotive industry expressed their concerns with the federal government's proposed sales targets for zero-emission vehicles. Ottawa's requiring that 60% of new light-duty vehicles sold in Canada have zero emissions by the year 2030. That sales mandate will increase to 100% by the year 2035.
Canadians expect certainty that they can afford, use, and charge their EVs in a manner that suits their different lifestyles and geographical requirements before making one of the most important purchasing decisions in their lives. Further, with the current high interest rates and high inflation severely impacting consumer affordability, many consumers lack the means to purchase EVs, as evidenced by the rising inventory levels on our dealers' lots today. Instead of attempting to dictate what individuals have to purchase, we suggest government focus on creating the right set of circumstances to stimulate demand.
Alberta's Finance Minister Nathan Horner says Ottawa is not prioritizing investment attraction. He says the Trudeau government is advancing policies and emissions targets that are unrealistic, unfair, and in some cases, unconstitutional. Horner met with federal, provincial, and territorial finance ministers in Toronto today to discuss his concerns. He says the federal government must recognize that achieving net zero on the electricity grid by the year 2035 is simply not feasible. He says it will result in a number of job losses and would cripple the Canadian economy. He added that Ottawa insists that affordability remain a top priority, yet has failed to heed provincial calls to remove the carbon tax. You know, fire can be a friend or a foe to our forests. Efforts to restore the ecosystems in parts of North America are being led by the Sandhills Prescribed Burn Association in North Carolina. The association teaches landowners skills about prescribed fires to help prevent wildfires.
Prescribed burn means that there is a very specific prescription. What it does is it takes what we would call, I guess, the pending hazards out of it. You look at your weather parameters, and you look at especially things like your wind conditions and your atmospheric stability to choose when that window, the ideal window for that burn.
The PBA is, I would say, a process by which a landowner can come in with an interest in using fire and pick up the skills and confidence they need to apply fire on their land. This is what it looked like before we took fire off the landscape. You would see these 2-foot burn scars, burn marks on the trees, because that's as tall as the fire got. There was not much fuel, so it came through at this level, burning everything up. Now, because we have so much fuel in the forest, it's catastrophic fires. But this is what we're trying to get back to right here.
Horticultural experts say plants are a vital part of our ecosystem. Associate Professor of Botany at the University of Lethbridge, Jenny McCune, has created a short film on the subject called The Quiet Green Creatures. She documents her study of the wood poppy. She also explains why some plant species here in Canada are at risk of extinction.
In Canada, we have some close to 4,000 different species of vascular plants. And the major reason that some of them are at risk of extinction is because they grow mostly in the southern part of our country, which is also where we like to live and work. And so we've been clearing a lot of their habitat for centuries to make way for our housing, our agriculture, our industry, and things like that.
Professor McCune shares more with BCN's Jeanette Rocher about bringing awareness of endangered plant species here in Canada. Watch for that informative interview coming up after Business News. Yeah, we need a little bit of rain for our plants and trees and to replenish our water supply here in southwestern Alberta. We had clouds mixed with sun today and right around the freezing mark, but no moisture. And it appears as though the mercury will be climbing just in time for the weekend. Full weather details are coming up. Well, we enjoyed a slightly cooler day today in Lethbridge. Not a bad weekend is shaping up either. So the great-great-grandniece of Mr. and Mrs. Claus, Santa Claus, Jeanette Rocher, is here now with all of the weather details. Nice Christmas outfit. Jeanette, it may be a nice weekend to head out to the Nikiyuko Japanese Garden and enjoy some of the Festival of Lights.
Oh, it sure will be. But keep in mind, we are going to be seeing some hefty wind gusts up to about 50 kilometers per hour from the southwest, both this evening and into tomorrow, Saturday, if you are thinking of hanging out outdoors. Just keep that in mind. Other than that, we are looking at fairly reasonable temperatures and well above seasonable. So remember, seasonal is actually anywhere from 0 to -12. So we're doing really good here. 4 degrees for an expected high on Saturday. 0 is the high on Sunday. I suspect we might be above that, though. Look at that, jumping all the way up to 9 degrees on Monday. 5 degrees is the expected high on Tuesday, high of 7 on Wednesday, and all the way up to 6 degrees on Thursday. And we're just getting so close to Christmas. So I am wondering if it is going to be a brown or green Christmas this year in Lethbridge. I guess time will tell. So as I was mentioning, average low for this time of year, basically -12, 0 the expected high. Record on this day was 16 degrees. That was back in 1962. And in 64, just 2 years later, we're looking at -32. Look what a variation that is. Okay, so sun rose this morning, 8:22. We're looking at a sunset this afternoon at 4:30. 31. We're now at 8 hours, 9 minutes of daylight, 1 minute less than we had yesterday as we get very close to that winter solstice, which is actually coming up next week, just before Christmas. Okay, high of 9 degrees in Victoria, expected tomorrow, mix of sun and cloud. Vancouver also looking at 8 degrees for a high. Could see a bit of wind on the Juan de Fuca Strait, and temperature sitting fairly steady all day. 2 degrees for an expected high tomorrow in Edmonton. Edmonton looking at possibility of flurries or showers. 6 degrees for an expected high in Calgary tomorrow, with mainly sunny skies as we get to the rest of the prairies. We're seeing a high of 3 degrees expected in Saskatoon. Saskatoon could see some showers, high of 2 degrees in Regina, and -3 for an expected high tomorrow in Winnipeg with clear skies. As we move over into the central part of the country, looking at mainly cloudy skies, and Toronto, high of 6 degrees right there. 2 for a high in both Ottawa and Montreal, but mainly sunny, so not too bad at all. As we get into Atlantic Canada, we're looking at an expected high in Fredericton of 0 with mainly sunny skies. Halifax seeing a high of 4 degrees, could see up to 50k winds though. Charlottetown looking at a 30% chance of either showers or flurries, high of 1 degree. St. John's could actually see possibility also of some showers or flurries later on in the day, and also some 60k winds over there by the coast. So that's it. That is your weather. I'll see you again in 2024.
Bank of Canada Governor Tiff Macklem says the central bank will begin considering cutting interest rates once inflation is back to around 2%. It is currently hovering around 3%. Macklem says he expects 2024 to be a transition year as higher interest rates slow down the economy and making way to lower inflation.
I know it's tempting to rush ahead to that discussion, but it's still too early to consider cutting our policy rate. Until we see evidence that we are clearly on a path back to 2% inflation, I expect Governing Council will continue to debate whether monetary policy is restrictive enough and how long it needs to remain restrictive to restore price stability.
The Bank of Canada held its key interest rate steady at 5% during its last 3 decision rate announcements. Rogers Sugar says it is pausing talks with the union representing striking workers at its Vancouver refinery after it rejected the company's latest offer. The workers have been on strike since September the 28th over issues like wages, benefits, and the company's proposal to increase operations at the refinery to 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. In the meantime, Rogers Sugar says it has restarted production of brown sugar at the refinery and says it has enough raw sugar on site to continue operating at reduced capacity until May of next year. The Vancouver refinery is one of only 3 large sugar refineries in Canada that processes imported cane sugar. The company building the Trans Mountain Pipeline extension says the project in British Columbia could be delayed by 2 years. Trans Mountain Corporation says it has asked the Canada Energy Regulator for a pipeline variance for a section of pipeline that's 2.3 kilometers of the project, but was denied. Trans Mountain says it now has reason to believe that moving ahead with a construction project plan through complex hard rock conditions could lead to drilling equipment failure. In addition to what it calls catastrophic delays to the project's timeline, a delay would lead to billions of dollars in losses for Trans Mountain. Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation says the annual pace of housing starts dropped 22% between October and November. The decline was led by a 27% increase in the amount of multi-unit urban housing starts. The 6-month moving average of the monthly seasonally adjusted annual rate of housing starts in November was actually up 0.7% from October. Now, here's a look at today's markets. The TSX was down 249 points on the day to finish at 20,529. The Dow was up 56 points to 37,305. The S&P 500 was down just under a point today to 4719, and the Nasdaq was up 52 points to 14,813. West Texas Intermediate Oil was up 15 cents to 71.73 US per barrel. Natural gas was up 7 cents to 2.47 US. Gold was down $16.74 on the day to $2,019.62 US an ounce, and silver was down 33 cents to $23.86 US an ounce. Feed wheat is at $9.23 per bushel, barley's at $6.86, canola's at $14.53, and corn is at $8.10 per bushel. Live cattle were up 73 cents to $168.23. Feeder cattle January contract was up $1.55 to $220.90. and lean hogs were down 75 cents to 67.18. The Canadian dollar was up slightly over the past 24 hours to 74.74 US. Recapping one of our top stories, a judge shot down applications from the truck driver who caused the deadly Humboldt Broncos bus crash to stay in Canada. Jaspreet Singh Sidhu has been fighting being deported back to India. He was given 8 years in prison for causing the 2018 crash, which killed 16 people and injured 13 others. He had pleaded guilty to dangerous driving charges and was granted parole earlier this year. The Canada Border Services Agency has recommended that Sidhu be deported. Sidhu's lawyer says he plans to apply to have Sidhu's permanent resident status reinstated on humanitarian grounds. You know, there's so many entertainers in the world today. We have comedians, actors, and different types of musicians and singers. Deanna Storfy hosts a one-person drama performance. She talked about her passion for sharing stories in this unique way, and she'll share details with BCN producer Michael Clausen in just a moment. When you see news happening in your community, be sure to send us an email at info@bridgecitynews.ca. And if you missed any of our local stories, visit our website, bridgecitynews.ca.
Now, most of us love watching some good acting. And if it's a good storyline that's well written, well, it can leave a lasting impact and impression on the audience. Today's guest joins us from Lethbridge. With me today is Deanna Storfy, and she's with Acting Up Drama and regularly performs one-person dramas. Welcome to Bridge City News, Deanna.
Glad to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Well, it's our pleasure to have you. Now, first off, can you tell us what is Acting Up Drama all about?
Really, I'm a storyteller. And so I love to bring the stories of faithful Christ followers of the past to life for people and audiences today, just to encourage their faith and also to encourage believers and non-believers alike, just with the goodness of God and his loving kindness that he has shown through the stories of what we would call even Christian heroes of the past.
Great. So could you give us just a snapshot of how you got started with this acting?
Well, it was quite a few years ago. I joined a drama ministry based out of Los Angeles called Covenant Players. And I was like fresh out of high school when I joined them, toured for 2 years. And I learned how to use drama as a means of communicating the gospel. And we traveled all over North America and just brought to life, using drama, just brought to life the gospel and the good news. And so when I settled here in Lethbridge a few years later, I just kept using what I'd learned there and used it in my church. And then I had kids and I was just always writing dramas and teaching others how to use drama to communicate and to, to act and to bring plays to life. So I've been doing it for many years. But when I was homeschooling my daughters, I ran across biographies of just people out of history, just ordinary people who had flaws and fears and doubts, and but how God used their ordinariness for his purposes. And so as I read those biographies, I realized my friends in church had no idea about many of the stories, like Corrie ten Boom, Gladys Aylward, John Newton, William Carey, Elizabeth Fry. And I'm reading, just eating up these stories. And I'm going, I'd love to use my gifts and abilities to share these stories with other people. And that's how it began.
Wow, that's very interesting. So why do you think that acting seems like a particularly effective way to communicate truth?
Well, it's a very, I would say, non-threatening way of bringing people into a story. Even a short skit or drama is really a short snippet of a story. And so it's not telling people what they should be doing, it's showing them what this truth looks like, and then people take from it what they need to out of it. And so, yeah, so we can sit there and watch a drama or a movie, and you'll get something different than I will. That's the great aspect of drama and story.
Right, it's really like similar to looking at a piece of art on the wall, and how different viewers will appreciate a different aspect of a painting, let's say. So does drama draw people in who otherwise perhaps might be hesitant to receive a truth or attend a church service maybe?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, that's many of the reasons why people will bring me into their church. Specific ministry, it might be seniors, it might be women's, it might just be their church service. In fact, I remember one pastor who invited me to his church in Calgary and asked me to tell the story of John Newton, and which is Amazing Grace, absolutely. And so he's the one who wrote the hymn Amazing Grace, knowing that many people have sung this hymn at funerals, at even just pretty much everywhere, everybody. Even when I go into the jail, women will sing Amazing Grace because they know at least the first 2 verses. And so he invited me to come and share, and it was actually during COVID. And this young fellow who had been to church, grew up in church, very strict church though, and so he walked away when he was in his later teens. But he had heard that, saw the sign outside their church that this story of John Newton, Amazing Grace, going to be shared at their service. And so he and his wife came, and he's been out of the church for 20 years. And when I told the story of John Newton from his wife's perspective, at the end, the church followed up with him, and he accepted the Lord, and he started coming to Bible studies. And he was just touched that God still loved them, no matter the fact that he'd walked away, and that God's love and his grace was still evident. And he realized it through story.
Wow. Well, that's a really wonderful testimony and feedback of the ministry that you're able to do. So this type of drama that you do, obviously it's unique in that it's a one-person presentation. And I'd like our viewers to take a quick peek at what that's actually like. So let's roll this clip.
That I am no longer Cornelia Tenboom of Haarlem, Holland. No, you see, I am now number 66730. My sister, number 66729. I moved through the line and I dropped the pillowcase of belongings, but I am holding on to the Bible and the bottle of vitamins. And I pray, oh dear Lord Jesus, please protect your precious word. You see, we Tenbooms have grown up reading the word of God every day. And I have found within these pages the reality of the world in which we live, but also the hope and strength that I need for every difficulty.
Tell us, what are some of the challenges of doing all this by yourself?
Because I actually research, I spend months researching the history, the time period, the person's story, and not just from one source, but a variety of sources. So that actually is not always necessarily the difficult part. I love, that's the creative outlet part that I thrive on. And then learning and my lines, memorizing, performing them, that's something I actually enjoy doing as well. But doing it on your own, see, I don't have to worry about, can someone rehearse? Is it conflicting with your schedule? I determine the schedule and I show up every single time. And so I find it easier in that way. But I always love sharing the tools that I've learned about drama to help other people. And I do something called interactive dramas, where I pull people out of the audience. It's a little different than my one-person dramas, but I've written scripts, and I pull people out of the audience and they become part of the story. And so there's a few different things that I do. But just doing something on your own, anyone, whether you're a comedian, a preacher, whatever, it's letting people know. The biggest challenge seems to be letting people know what you do and just getting the word out there. But usually when a church has me once, they'll have me back again. And so that's a good part of it.
Well, that's great. Now, something that piqued my curiosity in what you had just said previously was about being in prisons. So have you been able to perform in front of inmates here in Lethbridge at the prison? And if so, what was that like?
So in 2005, I had done research written with the help of a friend, a 2-act play for a local church here in Lethbridge, and to put on for Christmas. And it was a big event, and it was 40 actors, and it was all the costuming and all the stage. It was a big production. And then afterwards, I thought, wow, like, who's going to go to all this trouble? And I love this story. So I took the story, and it was the story of Elizabeth Fry, prison reformer from England in the 1800s. And that's the story that we brought to life for this church and community Christmas. But I thought, who's going to go to all that trouble? And I turned it into a one-person drama about Elizabeth Fry, not from her perspective, but from an inmate's perspective, doing all the research and everything again. And then the Lord spoke to me and said, I want you to volunteer at the local correctional center. And I went, what? I mean, you can research and you can perform about something, but actually doing it, that was a stretch. And for 6 months, I dug in my heels and just said, I can't do that. I don't know anything about inmates and prisoners and jail, but the Lord would not let me go. And so finally, I volunteered for a women's program, a women's program called WOW, Women of Worth. And it was back in 2005. Julie Kissick from Streets Alive here in Lethbridge and a number of other women from different churches were already in jail, already going once a week to just share the good news with women and bring chocolate. And
Nice.
So I started there. And so as a result, over the years, I would practice my plays on these women. I would literally dress up and go into this chapel and bring to life these stories of John Newton, Corrie ten Boom, who was in prison herself. And the gospel has been shared over and over with women in a very unique way.
Wow. And so do you have some examples of feedback maybe that you can give us of how you've been able to impact people through this?
So one day I was in Sears, back when Sears actually existed as a department store here in Lethbridge, because I've been volunteering at the jail for over 20 years here, or close to 20 years. So here was this gal, and I was in a clothing department, and this gal kept looking at me through the coat racks, and then she came up to me and she said, did you come into the jail? And I said, yeah. And she says, well, I was part of WOW, like one of the prisoners. And I said, oh, really? She goes, I remember the story you did about that woman in the concentration camp. It was fabulous. And it was like years later. Another example, I was on my way to Red Deer with some friends, and we were going to the youth conference from Lethbridge to Edmonton, stopped in Red Deer, just at the Tim Hortons, and I went out for a walk and went into this local restaurant, and the woman behind the till, she says, I know you. And she's like being kind of furtive, and I go, what? Yeah, where from? She goes, jail. And I said, oh, are you in WOW? She goes, yes. She said, I remember you guys. And she was out and she was doing well and she was working in her, in her restaurant. And she goes, I just loved the stories that you told. So yeah, so there's just so many. but not just from jail, from people in churches too. They'll come up to me years later and still remember, how I brought Corrie ten Boom's story to life. So it's just a very vivid visual, like plays and dramas are just very visual. And you usually remember a story. You don't always remember facts, but you can remember a story.
So then let me ask you, how has this ministry changed you?
Oh my gosh, you can't study the lives of people who surrendered their life and served God. And even in that struggle and the things they did and the mess ups they had, but how they experienced God's grace. And you can't but learn from them. They've been my mentors through the years. And I have learned about prayer. I've learned about obedience. I've learned about surrender from the examples of their lives. It has changed me. And then just stepping out of what's comfortable. I could just stay home and just think about doing this. But their examples were for me to step out of what's comfortable and see where God takes you. And that's what I've been doing all these years.
That's great. So if our viewers would like to have you perform at an event or maybe get in touch with you, how can they do that?
I have a website called actingupdrama.ca, and they can contact me through there.
Good. Well, I'm sure that our viewers enjoyed this conversation and will touch base with you. And I, for one, want to thank you so much for being with us today, Diana.
You're welcome. And thank you for the opportunity to share what I love so much to do.
It was our pleasure. That is Deanna Storfy, and she is with Acting Up Drama here in Lethbridge, Alberta.
An assistant professor at the University of Lethbridge and a filmmaker have teamed up to release a film highlighting their work in preserving endangered plant species across Alberta. To give us a better understanding of the journey behind this film, we welcome its creator, Professor Jenny McCune. Welcome to the show today, Jenny. Great to have you on.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Okay, so your movie is called The Quiet Green Creatures. I love that title. It reminds me of a little swamp monster or something, but that's not at all what we're talking about. So maybe tell us, what is the little film about? It's about 4.5 minutes long?
Yeah, it's a little video film that we put together about the research that my students are doing with endangered plants. And so The Quiet Green Creatures is kind of a play on the idea that people often don't think about plants as creatures, but they are. They're a big component of Canada's wildlife. And so I wanted to kind of do something that would be accessible, that people could learn about what we're working on.
Oh, that's so interesting. What inspired you to create it?
Well, even way back when I was a graduate student, I sort of heard a lot about the importance of communicating your research beyond the academic community and communicating it to the general public. And I went to a little workshop about making these little videos, and I thought, ooh, one day I want to do that.
What a great idea. I love that. And we are in the age of communication and definitely social media and filmmaking. So what better way than to kind of showcase your work there. So how did you originally get interested in plants and botany?
Ooh, that's a great question. I grew up on a farm in Southern Ontario, and so I did a lot of gardening and went on canoe trips in the summer and things like that. But I had a really, really good biology teacher in high school that did a great job with the plant part of it. And I sort of just became fascinated with the plants, and they're different than us, right? They're sort of like aliens in a way. They don't move around like we do, and they don't communicate like we do, but they're living creatures. And so I guess, yeah, it was way back in high school when I started kind of being interested in plants.
Mm-hmm. And there's so much research, it seems, coming out right now about plants and how they, I don't know, like how they interact and stuff. It's really interesting. It's kind of fascinating. But getting back to the film, so in the film, you're basically saying that there are currently plant species in Alberta and around the world that aren't flourishing, right? So what's limiting them from thriving?
Yeah, so in Canada, we have some close to 4,000 different species of vascular plants. And the major reason that some of them are at risk of extinction is because they grow mostly in the southern part of our country, which is also where we like to live and work. And so we've been clearing a lot of their habitat for centuries to make way for our housing, our agriculture, our industry, and things like that. And so in our case, we're working a lot, we're focused on these plant species in Southern Ontario, which used to be about 80% at least covered with forest. And now, depending on what county you're in, is somewhere between 5 and 40%. And so they're limited to these little chunks of forest kind of surrounded by, ag fields, cornfields, pastures, subdivisions, and cities. And so that can really take a toll on their ability to thrive, to move around the landscape. And of course, it also comes with other threats like exotic invasive species, changes in the herbivory, like are there more deer around chomping on them, things like that.
Yeah, it sounds like we're almost all competing for the same space right there.
Exactly, that's the thing. And if we can't leave, I mean, it's not just plants, it's endangered animals too. The biggest cause of them being endangered is us taking up more and more of their habitat. So if we can't set aside some for them, we might lose them.
Yeah. So what are the main factors putting these plants at risk? Is it humans basically?
Yeah, I would say it's almost all human caused or things that are linked up with things that humans are doing on the landscape. In some cases, we don't really know why some of them are so rare. So that's one of the things we're trying to test. So with the wood poppy that we're working with, there are only 5 populations in all of Canada. They're all in Southern Ontario, but they seem to be able to grow quite well, even in, people have planted them in their garden and they do quite well. So our hypothesis we're trying to test is maybe there is other habitat in the area that's suitable. It's just that they can't get their seeds there because their seeds are dispersed by ants. And so if you think about how far an ant could go, it's probably not going to cross a 100-acre cornfield, to get to a new place.
Exactly. Is there a specific type of plant life that you're currently trying to save, and why?
Well, Southern Ontario, Ontario in total has about 77-ish species of plants that are listed under our Federal Species at Risk Act. So there are plenty to choose from. We're focused on 2 for these trials where we're planting them. One is called the wood poppy and one is called the crooked stem aster. And so we've chosen those for various reasons, one of them being they produce tons of seeds. And so we can get seeds from those existing populations without causing any danger to the population. We wouldn't want to collect seeds from a tiny population that only produces a few every year.
Okay, well, you're an assistant professor at the University of Lethbridge. Are there any plant species around these parts, around southern Alberta, that you're specifically monitoring?
Yeah, we haven't studied any of Alberta's endangered plants. Here in Alberta, most of the plants that are listed on Canada's Species at Risk Act here are grassland plants, of course, because we're in the, down here in the south especially, the native vegetation is the grasslands, and those are the things that were cleared to make way for agricultural crops and things like that. So those include things like western spiderwort and the hair-footed loco weed and all these cool little grassland species. We haven't worked on any of those yet. We've done a bit of work in Waterton Lakes, looking at the response of plants after the big fire that happened there in 2017. But we haven't focused on any endangered plants here yet.
Okay, and are there plants that are kind of at risk around here?
There's definitely some rare ones, and whether or not they're at risk, some of them definitively are. So I think there's 12 in total that are rare enough and at risk enough to be listed under that Federal Species at Risk Act. Those ones are definitely, on the edge just because their native grassland habitat has been so reduced over time. But then there's others that are just rare and maybe maybe doing fine in a few places, like in the mountains. And, we don't know about very many populations, but hopefully, because they're growing high up in the alpine somewhere, they won't lose habitat, at least not to human development.
Right.
They might face a problem due to climate change if it gets too hot for them.
How do you monitor the growth of these plants, even the ones in Ontario that you're kind of looking at?
Yeah, so the ones that we're monitoring, so we're monitoring the existing populations, and we're also monitoring the ones that we plant. So what we do is we mark individual plants, we give them a little name tag basically, and we track them every year. So we measure how tall they grow, how many leaves they produce, how many flowers they produce, and how many fruits they produce. So that gives us an idea of how well they're doing. Are they reproducing? Are they growing really tall? And how does that change from year to year?
Okay, no, that's interesting. Almost like a little report card there.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no, that's neat. During the process of filming, did your team encounter any challenges?
I mean, field work is always challenging. You're out there with the mosquitoes and the humidity and the rain. I worry. So here, when I have students out here in the mountains, I worry about bears. In Ontario, I don't worry about bears. I worry about ticks. So ticks carrying Lyme disease are an issue. But while we were filming, I mean, we just had fun. I just had this little GoPro camera that I bought, and I just sort of filmed us as we were walking and planting and measuring things. And I wish that we had been there at the time of year when the wood poppy is in bloom, because it really is a spectacularly beautiful flower when it's in bloom.
Okay.
And in the film, it isn't in bloom, but it has fruits on it, so you can see the fruits, but not the
I
flowers.
saw the little green fruits. They weren't quite ripe yet. What time of year were you filming?
Oh gosh, when was I there? It must have been late June.
Okay. Yeah, it definitely looked summery, very, very green. Yeah, but it
Yeah.
almost looked a little rainy as well. Yeah, so basically big challenges are like the environmental elements, pretty much.
Yeah,
The
I mean,
climate,
if you're going to be a plant ecologist, you have to be ready to spend all day out in the forest with the
100%.
mosquitoes.
There you
Yeah.
go. Now, the short film communicates the importance of biodiversity. So what do you hope viewers will take away from it?
Well, I always try and raise the profile of plants a little bit. I think a lot of people, when they think of endangered species, they think of caribou or maybe even tigers and pandas and elephants and things like that. But I think it's important to get the word out that, endangered species include these quiet green creatures, these plants. And people love plants. It's not that we don't love plants, that people fill their houses with house plants and they get into their gardening. And so just hoping to kind of raise awareness that we also have some plant creatures that we're worried about here and that we're trying to conserve.
Okay, interesting. So what can the average person do about all of this? Like, for instance, are there any specific actions or changes that you hope your audience will be motivated to take after watching the film?
Oh gosh, yeah. Well, the things that an ordinary person can do, like one thing that I do is I support local land trusts, because they're often the groups that are helping to preserve nice pieces of habitat and so that those habitat pieces won't get developed.
Yeah.
So here in Alberta, for example, we have the Southern Alberta Land Trust Association, I think it's called SALTS. You can donate to a place like that. Also just, supporting designation of parks and protected areas and things like that, and voting for people who support that.
Okay.
But also just getting out and noticing the plants, now with apps like iNaturalist, where you can snap a picture, you can put it on the internet, and you can learn what species it is really quickly, is a
So
great way to
cool.
learn. Yeah, a great way to learn more about the plants that you have, right in your backyard or in your local park.
Yeah, for sure. Do you believe that this film could even spark an interest in the younger generation to gain a better understanding of your field?
Yeah, I hope so. I was saying it's another sort of aspect of it is, having it up on my website as kind of a tool for potential grad students to see, right? Or even undergraduates that might want to work with us. Every summer, we hire undergraduates to come out and be our field assistants. And so it's a way for them to see, what is it really like doing that job? Like, what is it like being out there in the forests for 3 months of the summer?
Yeah, for sure. Now, collaborative efforts are often very crucial in conservation projects, but are you able to maybe elaborate on some of the partnerships and collaborations in your film?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, the project itself is not just me. It's a group of collaborators, including the Wilder Institute, which is based at the Calgary Zoo. They are experts in reintroducing and translocating animals, but they wanted to, support us to learn more about using this tool for plants. And then the Nature Conservancy of Canada is a really important partner because they are the ones that have the land that we're working on. So they have these intact forests that we know are going to be preserved well into the future. And then we worked with a First Nations run native plant nursery called Guyana Say, and on the Six Nations Reserve in Southern Ontario. And so they were really important because obviously we were not going to grow 5,000 plants in Alberta and drive them to Ontario. We needed a place to grow them there.
That would have been a movie in itself there, about how you even did that. And then, and then speaking of filming, you mentioned you just had a little GoPro. Did you have another filmmaker with you or somebody that you kind of collaborated with to help you edit or anything like that?
Oh, absolutely. So, I came back with just this footage that I just gathered, and I was like, okay, here I am at this university that has, a whole new media program. There must be someone that can help me. So I was put in contact with Rodrigo Henriquez, who is the director, and just sort of said, here's all this footage. Here's a script of a voiceover that I wrote.
Okay.
Can you help me?
Do something with it. Help me.
Yeah. And so he's
Amazing.
got his own little company that does that kind of thing. And he was able to edit, splice all the things together, find this great music to put in the background. And I got to be in a studio, with headphones on doing the voiceover.
Yeah,
So
it was
really
great. Do you plan on doing any more films with Rodrigo in the future?
Oh, I'd love to. Yeah. And we've got more work coming up, both in Ontario and here in Southern Alberta. So it was a great experience. And I think, it's just a nice way to communicate what you're doing in a short, digestible piece.
Definitely. Yeah. It's not like a long documentary. It's just really short and to the point. And no, it was great.
Yeah.
Johnny, thanks so much for your time today. It looks like we're out of time here.
Oh, thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
No, it was great to kind of understand a little bit more about the work that you do. So thank you for that. Jenny McCune is an assistant professor at the University of Lethbridge and a botanist who has worked to protect endangered plant species across Alberta and Ontario, and I guess beyond. So great to have her on today. I'm Jeanette Roche on behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News. Thanks so much for watching.